The truth about the 5700X30 is it might not be as great as you think. We're gonna find this out in this 17 game benchmark if it's worth the hype. You're not gonna wanna miss out on this. We have a pretty simple system setup here. I'll be using the Ryzen 7 5700X3D, which I purchased off AliExpress, and comparing it to my Ryzen 5 5600. Both will be stock with no overclock. The Arctic Liquid Freezer 3 will be on both of my CPUs, which is pretty overkill for both of them, but at least we'll keep it nice and cool. I have 32GB of Patriot Viper CL18 DDR4 4000, and they're for both the CPUs. And lastly, I have the Zotac RTX 3070 LHR 8GB model, which we'll be using for both CPUs. Rebar will be on. The latest Nvidia drivers were used at that time when I was benchmarking, and every game will be done on a 3-run average besides the CPU synthetic benchmarks, which will be specified on the graph. Let's head on to the benchmarks. I have 3 synthetic CPU benchmarks here, and the first one is 7-zip with the decompression test on a 3-run average. For the average decompression on 7-zip, we got 104.2 for the score on the 5700X3D, and we got 84.63 on the 5600. That is a percentage difference of 20.72%. So not a bad improvement there at all. On Blender, on a 3-run average, we achieved 188.06 on the 5700X3D and 149.05 on the 5600. Now this was a performance gain of 26%, and I'm pretty happy with that, and it is to be expected. It is an 8-core CPU. Cinebench 2024 was an interesting result, and they were done on a 1-run average for both the multi and single core runs. The 5700X3D achieved 811 points for the multi-core and 85 points for the single core, whereas the 5600 achieved 654 for the multi-core and 89 for the single core. So we can clearly see that the multi-core was significantly better at a 21% performance difference. On the single core, we had a 4.49% loss compared to the 5600. Pretty happy with these synthetic results, and we can clearly see that the 8-core CPU definitely helps in productivity tasks. Starting off with our first game is a Plague Tale Requiem on high settings, and at 1080p, the 5700X3D pulled ahead slightly with the 87.17 FPS on average, which is a 3.2 FPS uplift over the 5600, which is a 3.9% improvement. For 1% lows, it was a good uplift as well at 8.10 FPS gain and a 19.6% uplift. At 1440p, the 5700X3D got 62.43 FPS on average, and the 5600 got 61.77. This was a 1% average FPS improvement, so not too much here. And on the 1% lows, it was a drop in FPS from the 5700X3D to the 5600 by 3.5 FPS. So pretty much similar results at 1440p, but we did see a slight improvement at 1080p. On Assassin's Creed Valhalla with ultra high settings at 1080p, we can see that both CPUs are pretty much similar at 115.53 FPS on average for the 5700X3D and 114.83 FPS for the 5600. Now the same thing goes for the 1% lows, as there's only a difference of 1.57 FPS in the 5600's favor. At 1440p, we see the same thing again, so very similar results, and there was only a difference of 0.7 FPS on average FPS in the 5700X3D's favor, and there was a 2.9 FPS difference between the 1% lows in favor of the 5600. So not too much of a difference even at 1080p or 1440p. Next up is Call of Duty Black Ops 6, and this was a little bit of an interesting title. So at 1080p, we achieved 86.87 FPS on the 5700X3D and 63.23 on the 1% lows. Now on the 5600 we achieved 97.33 FPS and 45.37 on 1% lows. So as you can see on the average FPS, there was a difference of FPS in the 5600's favor of 10.46. So the 5700 X3 lagged a little bit behind the 5600 in average FPS, but in terms of 1% lows, we definitely had a significant uplift, being 39.4% in 1% lows. So that's pretty good overall. At 1440p, the 5600 actually led the 5700 X3D with 70.27 FPS, which was a 11.34% higher average FPS, and it also outperformed in 1% lows with a 6.85% lead. So this was a little bit interesting at 1440p, although not too much of a difference. At 1440p we performed slightly worse than we did at 1080p. For control on high settings, the 5700 X3D delivered 132.90 FPS and the 5600 was 132.07 FPS, so pretty much the same thing. But on 1% lows we had a 21.1% improvement, so this was a good improvement in the 1% lows. At 1440p we have very similar results once again. So the 5700 X3D achieved 85.83 FPS on average, whereas the 5600's 85.87 FPS on average, and the 1% lows was just a 2.37 FPS difference. So very similar results at 1440p. Cyberpunk 2077 is up on high settings, and at 1080p they pretty much were equal in the average FPS, so 103.23 and 103.10 respectively for each of the CPUs. But in terms of the 1% lows, we had a 15.7% uplift, so a significant uplift in the 1% lows, which was great to see at 1080p. At 1440p we pretty much got a similar result once again, although on this instance we got similar results in terms of average FPS and the actual 1% lows. So there was only a difference of 0.5 FPS in the 5600's favor on the average FPS, and there was a 2.63 FPS in favor of the 5700 X3D. So not too much of a difference at 1440p, but the 1080p's 1% lows were in favor of the 5700 X3D. Next is Counter-Strike 2 on very high settings. At 1080p, we achieved 252.93 FPS on average FPS for the 5600 X3D, and 1% lows were 87.03. Compare this to the 5600's 198.20 at average FPS and 66.90 on 1% lows. Now, this was a significant uplift in both the 1% lows and the average FPS, so the percentage difference was 27.61 on average FPS, and the 1% lows was a 30% difference. This was a nice uplift and definitely shows that in more CPU heavy titles, at least on 1080p, we get a good advantage on the 5700 X3D. Now at 1440p, unfortunately, we don't see too much of a difference at all, so there's only a 0.3% difference on average FPS between the two, and only a 2% difference on 1% lows. So at 1440p, not too much of a difference here, and we can kind of see that we're getting a little bit GPU bound. So this is pretty much the maximum that this GPU can output. Next up is Forza Horizon 5, and at 1080p the performance was pretty much negligible, and the 1% lows was only a 4.97 FPS lead on the 5700 X3D. At 1440p, the 5700 X3D performed slightly worse than the 5600, and there was a 5.67 percentage difference for average FPS and a 6.91 percentage difference for 1% lows. We have Formula 1 2023 on high settings, and at 1080p, the 5700 X3D led the 5600 with a 20.3 FPS improvement, which is an 11.7% gain in average FPS. We also saw the 1% lows have a 15.93 percentage uplift, which was good for slightly smoother gameplay. Now at 1440p, we also have a similar situation, and the 5700 X3D gained 12.66 FPS over the 5600, and the 5700 X3D was slightly worse on 1% lows at 94.67, and the 5600 at 102.43 for 1% lows. GTA 5 is up with the high settings, and at 1080p we find that the 5600 was better at 121.57 FPS on average, which was a 7.6% performance gain compared to the 5700 X3D. And even in the 1% lows, it was a 10.3 percentage difference. At 1440p, we see that on average FPS, there was a 2.49 percentage difference on average FPS in favor of the 5600, whereas the 1% lows were pretty much the same, only a 0.53 FPS difference between the two. So a bit of an interesting title, but 5600 seems to have won this title overall. Hitman 3 is up next on ultra settings, and at 1080p we find that the 5700 X3D led with a 4.86 percentage advantage compared to the 5600, and at 1% lows it was an 8.77 FPS difference between the two. At 1440p we pretty much have the same results from both of the CPUs. We can see that we achieved 126.53 FPS on average FPS, and on the 5600 it was 125.90. So not much of a difference there again, and the 1% lows was only a percentage difference of 4.29%. So not too much over, but slight advantage to the 5700 X3D at 1440p and 1080p. For Hogwarts Legacy at 1080p, the 5700 X3D led with a 7.80 FPS ahead of the 5600, and it was just a 2.23 FPS difference in 1% lows. At 1440p, the 5700 X3D achieved 73.93 FPS, and it was a 11.9% improvement on average FPS compared to the 5600. Now the 1% lows were interesting here, and the 5700 X3D was actually slightly better with a 3.6 FPS difference. Still a little bit unfortunate here for the 1% lows, but we can see that at 1440p we're pretty much utilizing the maximum of what this GPU can do. For Horizon Zero Dawn, we're using the high settings, and at 1080p, the 5700 X3D was a 145.83 FPS on average FPS, and the 5600 was 136.37, which was a performance uplift of 7%, which isn't too bad, and the 5700 X3D had a 9.8% uplift in 1% lows compared to the 5600. Now at 1440p, we find that the 5700 X3D hit 118.03 FPS, which is a 3.46 FPS difference from the 5600, and the 1% lows saw a 7.3% uplift. So not too bad for the 1440p at 1080p results. The 5700 X3D has pretty much won this title. Jedi Survivor on high settings is up next, and at 1080p, the 5700 X3D achieved 89.87 FPS, and it was 6% faster than the 5600. The 14.07 FPS boost in 1% lows was pretty significant and was a 32.5% improvement. So not too bad at all. At 1440p, we can pretty much see that the 5600 and the 5700 X3D performed about the same. The only difference here is on the 1% lows, and it's a 2.03 FPS difference. So not too bad at 1080p, but 1440p we pretty much saw similar results. Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 is up next, and this is on high settings, and I was using the London map. So on 1080p, we find that the 5700 X3D was actually worse, and not by a little bit. This was with quite a difference, so at 24.68 percentage difference. So I'm quite disappointed with this. And the 1% lows were slightly worse at 10.9%. So yeah, not too great on 1080p, and 1440p follows same suit. The 5700 X3D kind of just struggled compared to the 5600, and this was a 20 21.68% drop in average FPS, and in 1% lows it was a 15.37% difference. A little bit disappointing for the 5700 X3D on Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is up next on high settings, and at 1080p you can see we pretty much got the same results, so under 1% percentage difference between the two. And at 1440p again we get pretty much the same thing, just a 1.04% difference at average FPS, and on 1% lows it was a 3.75% difference. A bit disappointing again from the 5700 X3D, but it could be this is like a limitation of the RTX 3070 that I have. Shadow of the Tomb Raider on high settings was pretty interesting here, and the 5700 X3D matched the 5600 in average FPS, so the same result, but we had a good improvement at 18.6% in favor of the 5700 X3D for 1% lows. At 1440p, the average FPS was pretty much the same, but the 1% lows was a 8.07% difference in favor of the 5600. So pretty much very similar results at 1440p, but we had better 1% lows at 1080p for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Last but not least, the Callisto Protocol on high settings. At 1080p, we had pretty much identical average FPS, and on 1% lows, it was a 5.23% difference. At 1440p on average FPS, we have very similar results, but it was just a 0.8% difference. However, the 1% lows were actually in favor of the 5600, so it was 37.80 on the 5600, and on the 5700 X3D it was 34.50. A little bit interesting here, but very similar results between the two CPUs. At 1080p, for all 17 games, the 5700 X3D was 5% faster than the 5600 on average FPS. As we can see, the percentage difference graph here is alright. I mean, the biggest one here is from Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is a 24.69% difference in favor of the 5600, which is a bit concerning, and as well Call of Duty Black Ops 6 at 10.75%. Now the biggest percentage difference in favor of the 5700 X3D is Counter-Strike 2 at 27.62%, and the next is Control on DX12 at 21.08%. So we can see here that a game like Counter-Strike 2, which is heavily reliant on the CPU, had a significant performance difference, which was in favor of the 5700 X3D at 1080p. I think at 1080p it shows a good representation of what the RTX 3070 is actually capable of, because I think at 1440p in the graphs you guys will see, we're a little bit GPU limited. But we can see that the 5700 X3D did alright, but it's only about 5% faster on average on these 17 games. I wish it was more, but let's head over to the 1% lows. For the 1% lows at 1080p, we saw a decent uplift with the 5700 X3D being 11% faster on average compared to the 5600 over the 17 games. I'd say that's a pretty hefty improvement, and there's only 5 titles here which the 5600 did better in for 1% lows. Again, we see Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 performing better on the 5600, and that's something I might need to revisit in the future, as the game had just released when I did this benchmark. And interestingly enough, Call of Duty Black Ops 6 had a 39% performance difference between the 5700 X3D and the 5600, because in the average FPS it had actually done better on the 5600, so at least we're getting an improvement in 1% lows in that game. I'd say at 1080p this is a pretty big win for the 5700 X3D. Not sure if this is enough to win over in terms of price, but it definitely is a good win in terms of 1% lows. Heading over to the 1440p benchmarks, on average FPS in percentage difference for the 17 games, as we can see here, it didn't perform the best. It was just 0.1% faster on average FPS for the 5700 X3D versus the 5600. Now, this was a bit disappointing at 1440p, but I think we might actually just be reaching the limits of the RTX 3070, and unfortunately I don't have a graphics card more powerful than it to test the 5700 X3D. I guess what this can show us is that pretty clearly any card below the RTX 3070, the 5700 X3D will be more than able to handle. Now unfortunately, as I said, I don't have any cards above the RTX 3070, so I'd love to see how much we could push the CPU, but as far as I can tell, in a mid-range build, you should be good to go. Now interestingly enough, in terms of average FPS, the only significant improvement we got was from Formula 1 2023 at 9.37% percentage difference. And again, Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 at a 24% performance difference in favor of the 5600 was a bit disappointing. Now, majority of the other titles are actually almost below 1%, which is a bit sad, a little bit disappointing, but it could just be due to the graphics card that I have. Now the 1% lows at 1440p pretty much tell a similar story for these 17 games, although Counter-Strike 2 had a significant performance difference at 30%, so that's pretty good. But on average, the 1% lows were 2% faster on the 5700 X3D compared to the 5600. That's a little bit disappointing here as well, as only 6 of the 17 games here are above a 1% difference, which is kind of sad. But at the same time, again, we're probably reaching that RTX 3070 maximum that it can output. But it is a little bit interesting how the 1% lows swayed a little bit in the favor of the 5600. At least at 1440p. On average FPS as well, we can see there was only 3 games that were above a 1% difference in favor of the 5700 X3D, so a bit of a disappointing one at 1440p, but I think it's that RTX 3070 that's pretty much getting to its maximum limit here, but I would have loved to see a little bit of a more performance difference in terms of percentage, but hey, it is what it is, and this is what we got. That's not to say that the CPU is bad in any sense of the word, because if we're putting aside just the gaming benchmarks and we're actually going to include the CPU benchmarks, then it's clearly a better productivity CPU, and it's pretty cheap if you get it off AliExpress. But I'll be going over the pricing data and we'll see how it compares to the 5600 and in terms of price and cost per dollar and some of my final thoughts. Now for the pricing. All of the categories here except for the Newegg pricing include New Zealand GST, goods and services tax, which is 15%. This is known as VAT overseas. One of the 3 AliExpress listings had a small shipping price, and one of the New Zealand retailers that I included is currently out of stock. All exchange rates were taken as of the 19th of January 2025. The US dollar pricing is in blue on the left, and the New Zealand dollar pricing is in orange on the right. You can see from the time I bought at $135 US in November 2024, the price has increased to $210 US, which is an increase of $75 US from the top 3 listings sorted by sales on AliExpress. Mind you, AliExpress is not having a sale at the moment. You can see the New Zealand retailers are the most expensive at $240 US, which is $15 US more than the Newegg listing and $105 US more than the price I paid. You can clearly see why I purchased mine off AliExpress instead of my own country. If you want to purchase off AliExpress, I have another video weighing up the pros and cons linked in the description. At more than $195 US or 350 New Zealand dollars currently for the 5700 X3D, I might question, why wouldn't you pick the 7500F or the 7600, as they are both in a similar price category? I'll give some more insight of this in my final thoughts. Next is the cost per frame data on the 17 game average in US dollars based on my RTX 3070. It's honestly pretty good that we got $1.51 US at 1440p and $1.09 at 1080p. At 1080p, that is a 61 cent cheaper per frame than the current AliExpress pricing and 84 cents cheaper than the New Zealand retailers. As you can see, it really depends on how cheap you can get the CPU to see if it's worth it for gaming. Mind you, this frame data is based on my RTX 3070 only, but I think it gives a good indication. Let's head on to my final thoughts. As we saw, the Ryzen 7 5700 X3D performed alright compared to the 5600 in terms of gaming performance. Notably, at 1080p, the 1% lows saw a decent uplift at 11% compared to the 5600, which I was quite pleased with. It's important to note that the 5% improvement on average FPS was quite low overall for these 17 games. with 9 out of the 17 games being less than 1% percentage performance difference. At 1440p, the results were a bit disappointing, but I believe it shows us why the 1080p results are really important for a CPU test. On the 17 games, it was only a 0.16% improvement on average FPS compared to the 5600. What I believe this shows us is that the RTX 3070 at 1440p is reaching its GPU limit. As mentioned, we could say that a card below the RTX 3070's performance should be fine with either one of these CPUs. I'm happy to say that the 1% lows improved for smoother gameplay at 1080p, which is the resolution I'd assume the CPU is aimed towards. I believe the CPU is also for someone who wants to upgrade but already has a decent AM4 setup. The 5700 XUD can make sense for someone who is on something before Ryzen 5000, so something like the Ryzen 5 3600, especially if you play esport titles. If you're getting AliExpress pricing, this CPU competes with the 5600, which is currently 180 New Zealand dollars in my country, or this USD price on screen. So who is the CPU made for? The predicament comes in the recommending of the CPU from how you actually buy it. If you buy it off AliExpress for 180 US dollars, you have an absolute steal. If you're paying full price at a retailer, so over 350 New Zealand dollars, I'd ask myself, do I really want to invest further in AM4, or should I just sell everything and move on to AM5? Because personally, I don't think it's worth it, at least if you're already on a Ryzen 5000 chip for pure gaming. If we consider the Ryzen 5 7600, which costs a similar price and performs similarly to the 5700 X3D, there could be an argument made in favor of the 7600 just in terms of pure upgradability for the future on AM5. The 3D V-Cache is nice and should play a lot better with higher tiers of graphics cards for the future. There is no doubt to me that this is a good CPU for productivity and even gaming, but its biggest problem I see is that AM4 is pretty much end of life now. If you want to upgrade to the best CPU AM4 has to offer that's in stock, the Ryzen 7 5700 XUD is it. But I reckon you need to get it for the right price. Take for example, when AM4 released, I myself had a 1500X with a B350 motherboard. That same motherboard, the B351, is able to take a 5700 X3D with a simple BIOS update. Same thing goes for AM5 at the moment. If you bite the bullet for AM5, it might actually work out in the long run. If you're trying to make a budget PC as well, this could be an amazing PC if you get a second-hand B350 or B450 motherboard. I can see the justification there. The same thing goes for the AliExpress route. It's so cheap that you could just resell it in the near future. If you guys want a breakdown on the AliExpress pricing, check out the video that I've already made, link in the description. If you pay the normal retail price, you might lose out in terms of getting your money back in the short term. Another point is if you're going to have a mid to low end graphics card, the 5700 X3D should be able to handle it, as we saw with my RTX 3070. So if you are currently CPU limited, like at 1080p for example, it could be an easy way to smooth out your frame rates without building basically a whole new system. But personally, if you really need an upgrade and are paying above 350 New Zealand dollars, I'd say, why don't you have a look at AM5? It would be probably better for you in the future. In short, if you buy it on AliExpress, you should get a good deal even in terms of reselling in the near future. If you buy it from retail, I'd consider AM5, such as the 7600 or 7500F, and see how much I could sell my AM4 setup for. If you're building brand new, please go with AM5. Do not bother with AM4 anymore. If you're upgrading from before Ryzen 5000, it should be a decent uplift in games. If you're building a second-hand PC, this could be an amazing way to get really good performance by slapping that 5700 X3D onto a cheap B350 motherboard with a BIOS update. Lastly, if you need to save some cash, go with the 5700 X3D. If you can splurge a little bit more for a new motherboard, CPU, and RAM, go for AM5. That about sums up the video. Check out wisetech.org for some more awesome content. But other than that, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!